Hello everyone, my name is Kyra Gegner, and this semester I researched and implemented a HeapSpray project. Memory exploitation techniques are a critical component of cybersecurity education, yet they are notoriously difficult to teach effectively. Students often struggle to bridge the gap between theoretical concepts and practical applications in real-world situations. The problem is partially due to the scarcity of hands-on labs specifically designed for memory attacks. Those that do exist can be impractical in educational settings. While some incredibly beneficial labs do exist, like the Bomb Project and Attack Lab, currently there is no widely distributed or known project to help teach heap spraying in an accessible educational context. Thus, my project this semester aims to address this gap by developing a foundation for a heap spray attack lab that can be integrated into CS270. It provides a controlled, measurable practice platform where students can experiment safely while gaining practical experience. The intentions for this lab are to either supplement the current buffer overflow project or to potentially replace it in the future to offer students a more comprehensive understanding of modern exploit techniques. Heap spraying is a foundational technique in the domain of memory exploitation. It emerged in the early 2000s primarily as a browser exploitation technique, revolutionizing how attackers approached memory corruption vulnerabilities. Understanding this technique, and other techniques in general, is crucial to properly defending against them. Heap spraying gained prominence during the period when Internet Explorer dominated the browser market and was plagued by numerous memory-related vulnerabilities. During this time, attackers discovered they could reliably exploit these bugs by filling large portions of the browser's heap with shell-coded malicious data, raising the probability that an indirect memory reference would land in a sprayed region and transfer execution. It proved so effective that heap spraying became a standard component in web-based attacks for several years. What makes it particularly interesting and important from an educational perspective is its continued relevance despite years of attempted mitigations. Although significant advancements in memory protection mechanisms were made, variations of heap spraying still appears in modern exploit chains. Implementing this lab presented several significant technical challenges. Heap spraying attacks were primarily performed against web browsers, with Internet Explorer being the most prevalent target. Recreating this environment for educational purposes required me to translate a technique designed for specific and outdated software to something easily accessible and relevant. A key technical challenge was adapting the attack methodology. In real-world scenarios, heap spraying is typically performed using JavaScript, which provides attackers with high-level access to dynamic memory allocation in the browser. For this lab, I wanted to implement these concepts in C, since that's the language used in CS270. To do so, I had to deconstruct the attack and re-implement its core principles at a lower level. Another important consideration was finding the right balance between safety and realism. A lab too realistic could create security risks, and one too simple would fail to teach the important concepts. One of the more complex design considerations was the non-deterministic nature of heap memory. In real systems, heap layouts vary between runs and platforms, which is why heap spraying evolved as a probabilistic technique. Replicating this non-determinism in a controlled environment required careful design decisions about randomization. Enough variability to demonstrate why the technique works, but with sufficient consistency for assessment and potential grading purposes. There are multiple facets of heap spraying attacks that makes them unique in comparison to other exploit techniques. Unlike most methods, heap spraying does not directly exploit a vulnerability on its own. Rather, it serves as a reliability enhancer that dramatically increases the success rate of other techniques. Heap spraying is one of the few techniques that remains effective in unpredictable memory environments, where precise memory addresses are unknown or randomized. When faced with modern defenses like address space layout randomization, attackers can use heap spraying to turn a low probability exploit into a highly reliable one by playing what could be considered a numbers game with memory allocation. Perhaps most interestingly, heap spraying has evolved alongside the defensive measures developed to prevent it. As mitigations like DEP, ASLR, and control flow integrity have emerged, attackers adapted their spraying strategies to overcome them, showing incredible resilience. This is a key reason it remains relevant today, and why it's important that students understand its foundational concepts. I divided this project into two distinct parts, research and implementation. I started by conducting a literature review of heap spraying techniques through academic papers and technical blog posts discussing either particular aspects of heap spraying or specific attacks that occurred. Through this, I was able to gain a solid understanding of how the attacks worked and how they evolved over time. To help ground the project in real-world relevance, I analyzed exploit samples in controlled environments. There are multiple comprehensive heap spraying tutorials that are available online, but they utilize deprecated software and legacy browsers, which prevented me from following along with them or replicating them directly. However, they were still incredibly useful to read through as they helped me understand the structure and execution flow of heap spray attacks, which influenced the design of my lab. In addition to reading tutorials, I researched documented heap spraying attacks that have occurred. I studied how attackers leveraged browser-specific behaviors to create reliable exploits. The comparison across different attack cases helped me identify recurring vulnerabilities and understand how attackers exploited them. This aspect of my research was particularly helpful when determining how to translate the attacks into a standalone C program. Finally, I examined modern mitigation techniques that have evolved to counter heap spraying attacks. This helped me understand how heap spraying has evolved to overcome the mitigations and to ensure the lab demonstrated challenges that real-world exploits face on some level. After completing my research and gaining a foundational understanding, I began developing a hands-on lab environment using C as the implementation language. At the core of the lab is a simulated heap memory space that students can directly interact with and manipulate. This allows them to observe exactly how their payloads behave in memory. During development, I was concerned about safety. Failure in this lab is likely to some extent, so I implemented process isolation using Fork to ensure that when testing exploits, any crash or unexpected behavior remains contained in the child process, leaving the main program unaffected. This also allowed for multiple testing attempts without restarting the program, so students can see how their payload performs over many instances. For memory management, I ended up using mmap to allocate memory regions with executable permissions, giving students a realistic environment where code injection is possible while avoiding permission issues. I also incorporated some randomization to simulate the probabilistic nature of real-world exploits. This was aimed to help students understand why heap spraying uses redundancy and placement strategy to increase reliability. There are several core components of a heap spray attack. One of the most prominent components is the NOP sled. This is a sequence of harmless no-operation instructions that creates a landing zone for imprecise jumps in memory. If the execution lands anywhere on the sled, it simply slides through each NOP until it reaches shellcode. The strategic placement of shellcode is equally important. Attackers must consider not only the quantity of payloads, but also how they're distributed across the heap. Since they cannot predict the exact landing address, multiple instances of shellcode, preceded by NOP sleds typically, are scattered throughout the heap to maximize chances of execution. Heap predictability is influenced by several factors that shape the attacker's strategy. The size of allocated objects determines how much memory can be filled per spray operation. Allocation patterns, such as browser object creation or scripting behavior, affects memory layout. Meanwhile, heap fragmentation introduces gaps that can disrupt NOP sled continuity and reduce the reliability of shellcode placement. Another critical consideration is the optimal density of heap spraying. Attackers must balance memory coverage with system limitations. Spraying too sparsely can reduce the chances of success, while spraying too densely risks exhausting available memory or crashing the program. The goal is to find the point where the exploit has a high probability of success without triggering defenses or degrading performance. The battle between attackers and defenders is ongoing, with new exploitation techniques emerging in response to evolving defensive strategies. Heap spraying is a unique example of this, as it began as a relatively simple technique and has gradually evolved into more sophisticated variants to bypass modern security mechanisms. Early heap spraying relied on JavaScript and browsers to allocate predictable objects, often using large strings or arrays filled with shellcode and NOP sleds. While straightforward, it was remarkably effective against unprotected systems. As browsers began implementing basic mitigations, attackers responded with creative adaptations. One variation is JIT spraying, which targets just-in-time compilation in browsers and other runtimes. Attackers craft JavaScript code with specially encoded constants that, when compiled to machine code, produce patterns resembling shellcode. Heap feng shui is another sophisticated approach, involving precise manipulation of the heap layout through careful allocation and deallocation sequences. By understanding how the memory allocator works, they can position objects at specific offsets, setting up the conditions for controlled corruption. DOM spraying exploits how browsers allocate document object model elements in memory. By creating large numbers of elements, with carefully crafted properties or HTML content, attackers can control significant portions of the heap. This method avoids the use of suspicious JavaScript structures, like oversized arrays, that may be flagged by browser defenses. Use after free vulnerabilities were some of the most common examples I found. After an object is freed but still referenced, attackers can fill the freed memory with controlled data. This causes the program, upon reusing the stale pointer, to interact with attacker-controlled content, potentially executing injected code or corrupting program logic. Heap spraying also intersects with techniques like return to libc and return-oriented programming, which are used to bypass memory protections such as data execution prevention. Rather than spraying actual shellcode, attackers may populate the heap with addresses pointing to legitimate code, either in system libraries or sequences of short instruction fragments called gadgets. When control is transferred to these addresses, the attackers chain together pre-existing code to achieve arbitrary behavior without executing injected shellcode. Just as the techniques involved, so did the prevention techniques. Address space layout randomization disrupted traditional heap spraying by randomizing where code and data are loaded. As a result, attackers could no longer reliably predict where their payloads would land, significantly reducing the effectiveness of basic heap spray techniques. Data execution prevention addressed the problem from another angle by marking memory regions as either executable or writable, but never both simultaneously. This meant that even if attackers could inject their shellcode into the heap, that code couldn't execute directly. Control flow integrity mechanisms further restricted attackers by ensuring program execution follows valid, predetermined control flow paths. By validating jump destinations at runtime, CFI prevents arbitrary jumps to sprayed memory regions. Modern JIT compilers introduced various hardening techniques like randomizing the memory locations of generated code and placing guard pages around JIT regions to prevent the increasingly popular JIT spray technique. Once an attack has occurred, detection becomes the priority. There is some sophisticated modern detection system like Microsoft's Nozzle, which analyzes memory for patterns commonly associated with heap spraying, like high concentrations of executable content or NOP sleds. More recently, machine learning approaches have shown promise in identifying heap spraying attempts by analyzing memory allocation patterns and content distribution. By looking at real-world examples, we can see how these variations and mitigations have played out. Operation Aurora targeted Google, Adobe, and dozens of other major companies in 2009 and 2010. Attackers exploited a zero-day, use-after-free vulnerability in Internet Explorer, combined with heap spraying techniques to ensure reliable exploitation. The attackers used this approach to bypass security mechanisms and gain access to highly sensitive source code repositories and intellectual property. Another notable case involved the Veterans of Foreign Wars website. In 2014, attackers exploited a use-after-free vulnerability in IE10, but what made this attack unique was its sophisticated three-stage exploit chain. The initial stage used heap spraying to establish memory control, followed by more targeted memory manipulation in subsequent stages. The attackers altered the website's HTML to introduce a malicious iframe that would trigger their exploit chain when visitors browsed the site. Flash player attacks represent another critical example where heap spraying proved incredibly effective. Attackers leveraged ActionScript, Flash's programming language, to spray the heap and bypass ASLR protections. They were particularly dangerous due to their drive-by nature. Users only needed to visit a compromised website for the malicious Flash content to execute automatically. The second portion of this project involved code implementation. I developed a controlled simulation environment in C designed to give students practical, hands-on experience with heap spraying techniques. The program models key aspects of heap memory management in a safe and observable way. As shown on the workflow diagram, the program follows four main phases. In the first phase, the program initializes a sandbox environment for students to interact with. The second phase is the student implementation stage, where students are tasked with filling the payload function to design their heap spray attack. Students face several technical challenges in this lab. They must create a NOP sled to guide execution to their payload. They also need to write shellcode that calls the internal success function, requiring them to understand the basics of assembly and memory addressing. Most importantly, they must strategically distribute their shellcode across the buffer to maximize the likelihood of a successful execution. What makes this particularly challenging is the heap fragmentation phase. The program intentionally breaks certain memory regions with invalid instructions, simulating real-world heap conditions. This forces students to think carefully about shellcode placement and redundancy. Placing a single copy at the end of the NOP sled won't prove effective. Each student's solution is tested through multiple randomized attempts and provides success rates for the students to evaluate their strategies with. Digging into the technical details, for memory allocation, I utilized mmap to allocate 200 objects of 1,000 bytes each, creating a substantial spray area that students can target. While I initially used malloc in combination with mprotect, I transitioned to mmap for both simplicity and better control over memory permissions and alignment. As previously mentioned, I wanted to integrate some level of real-world conditions, so I implemented memory fragmentation. Certain regions of memory are filled with invalid instructions that will crash execution if control flow lands there. This forces students to consider shellcode placement carefully, as poor spray strategies will result in failed attempts. A key component of the lab is the randomized execution entry point, which illustrates the probabilistic nature of heap spraying. For each test attempt, the program jumps to a random location within the sprayed memory, with added entropy to reflect the imprecision typical of real-world exploits. This is implemented using a function pointer cast, simulating how an actual control flow hijack might redirect execution in practice. Process isolation through forks serves safety and practical purposes. It prevents crashes from affecting other attempts, which will likely occur due to fragmented memory and random jumps, and allows the program to collect statistics. The parent process monitors each child attempt, and uses exit codes to determine if it was successful. This creates a measurement system to see how effective the student's shellcode turned out to be. Testing proved to be rather time-consuming. The program was initially written to call an external program, but was eventually modified to call a function within the same program. The initial draft of the program didn't contain heap fragmentation. However, I quickly realized that students could simply create one long NOP sled followed by shellcode, which would almost always succeed. To make the exercise more realistic and educational, I introduced fragmentation. This way students would be forced to think more strategically and would gain a better understanding of real-world heap spray conditions. During development, I experimented with different fragmentation parameters to find the right balance. Too little made the exercise trivial, while too much made it too difficult to succeed. Testing with varied percentages and fragment sizes helped me establish a balance that challenges students while remaining achievable. I also tested edge cases that could occur during random execution. These included jumping to the beginning or end of memory objects, landing on the shellcode, landing in the middle of the shellcode, and using minimal NOP sleds. These tests helped ensure that the program behaved as expected under a wide range of execution scenarios. I also tested memory alignment issues, which are common in real-world exploits, to make sure that they didn't have any unintended behavior in our controlled lab environment. Finally, I simulated some common student errors like putting an incorrect function address or missing shellcode entirely to ensure the code handled it correctly. Although many things can go wrong during execution, a successful payload typically begins with a large NOP sled. By filling most of the heap with NOP instructions, students create a wide landing zone that increases the likelihood of guiding control flow smoothly towards their shellcode, regardless of where execution begins. The shellcode itself is compact but effective, just 12 bytes in its entirety. It begins with the move ABS instruction to load a 64-bit address into the RAX register. This is followed by 8 bytes that serve as a placeholder, which is dynamically patched at runtime with the actual address of the success function. Finally, a jump RAX instruction transfers control to that address. This approach allows the payload to remain flexible and executable across multiple runs despite address randomization. Strategic shellcode placement is what determines the success rate of the students. Rather than placing shellcode randomly, they should consider placing it at set intervals or at strategic locations manually. Although placing too many copies can backfire. If execution lands in the middle of the shellcode block, it may crash or behave unexpectedly. Students need to develop a placement strategy that balances coverage with precision, avoiding fragmented zones and minimizing the risk of partial execution. While this project lays the groundwork for a comprehensive hands-on heap spraying lab, there are still improvements to be made. One such improvement is to incorporate measures to prevent students from cheating. This could include generating unique function addresses or fragmentation patterns for each student, or requiring detailed explanations of their approach, changes they made, and their results, or even in-person demonstrations where students have to make small modifications to demonstrate their understanding. Another improvement I would love to see happen is the project evolving into a multi-level project where students progress through increasingly complex challenges. The current implementation could serve as the first level as it focuses on basic heap spraying and shellcode execution. A subsequent level could incorporate some level of system protections, such as simulating real-world control flow integrity defenses, which would prevent students from jumping directly to the success function. Instead, they may have to take advantage of helper functions to get there indirectly. A more advanced level could introduce the concept of exploit chaining, requiring students to trigger multiple target functions in sequence. This could illustrate how complex real-world attacks are often constructed from simpler building blocks. Additional levels could task students with exploiting pre-existing vulnerabilities themselves, such as use after free or buffer overflows, before applying heap spraying techniques to complete the exploit. This approach would combine multiple exploitation techniques and deepen student understanding of how they interact. There's a lot of potential to expand this project, and I hope to see it developed. I genuinely learned so much by taking on this project, even beyond the technical implementation. I developed a much deeper understanding of memory protection mechanisms like ASLR and DEP, and how modern systems use them to defend against exploitation. Heap spraying initially seemed like a very simple concept, but I gained an appreciation for the complexity and strategy required to pull it off in real-world scenarios. I also found the evolution of the attack incredibly interesting. Rather than disappearing when faced with mitigations, attackers adapted to it and overcame them. There was a lot of ingenuity and creativity from both sides. One of the most difficult and most rewarding parts of the project was simplifying complex ideas in a way that still preserved the core concepts. I learned that teaching security is less about replicating real-world behavior exactly, and more about preserving the why behind how things work, even if that requires abstraction. Finally, I discovered that designing security problems, and likely problems in general, is fundamentally different from creating solutions to problems I know are solvable. It was really interesting to take on the opposite perspective. Here are my sources. Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this project as much as I enjoyed building it.